Peter was a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, and everyone in the village knew it. He adored his wife Anne and their two children, Tina and Victor. His love for them was the talk of the village, and it wasn't uncommon for neighbors to watch in awe as he spent hours helping Anne with household chores or carrying the children on his back while they giggled and played. Peter was a man who made sure that his family was his priority, and his affection for Anne in particular was something everyone admired. The family's bond was unshakable, and the sight of them together was a symbol of happiness for those around them. But as the days passed, an unsettling silence began to creep into their once vibrant home. It began one ordinary morning when Peter complained of a headache, a symptom he brushed off as mere fatigue from the hard work of the day before. However, as the hours went on, his condition worsened. By midday, Peter could barely lift his head, his skin cold and clammy. Anne, frantic with fear, rushed him to the village clinic. Doctors were puzzled and immediately transferred him to the nearest hospital. Anne stayed by his side, her hands never leaving his, her heart racing with worry. The night came, and so did the inevitable. Peter passed away quietly, leaving Anne and the children shattered. It felt like the world had crumbled around her, and nothing could heal the wound of his sudden death. But what was worse than the unbearable pain of loss was the growing suspicion among the villagers, a suspicion that pierced Anne's grieving heart like a sharp blade. Whispers began to swirl, accusations she never could have imagined. It wasn't enough that she had lost her husband. Her in laws, bitter and unkind, began to accuse her of causing Peter's death. They claimed she had poisoned him, a claim that tore at Anne's soul. Anne was a woman with a heart full of love for her family. And yet, here she was, standing at the crossroads of grief and betrayal. The weight of her in law's accusations crushed her. They told her that Peter's sudden illness and death couldn't have been natural. There had to be a darker force at play. You killed him, they would say, their words cold and harsh, a constant reminder of their disdain. As days passed, Anne found herself in a haze, trying to cope with the loss of her husband, while enduring the emotional and verbal abuse from those who should have been comforting her. Every day felt like a nightmare that she couldn't escape from. The more she wept, the crueler they became, insisting that she was hiding something, something sinister. And they made it clear that they would not rest until they had proof that she was guilty. Then came the day of Peter's burial, a day Anne would never forget. The women of the village gathered around, some offering comfort, but others watching with an almost unnatural interest. Anne, dressed in white, her face pale and eyes red from crying, tried to prepare herself for what she knew would be a painful final farewell to her beloved husband. But as they lowered his body into the grave, her in-laws approached, their expressions grim. You must prove your innocence, they declared, their voices sharp as knives. You must drink the water that was used to bathe your husband's corpse. Anne recalled in horror. I I can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't kill him. I swear on his grave. But her cries fell on deaf ears. The women of the village, following the old traditions, held her down as they shaved her head, leaving her bald and vulnerable. The ritual was meant to cleanse her, to confirm whether or not she was guilty. Anne's heart raced in terror. If she refused, the village would condemn her and she would be left with nothing, no family, no love, no peace. Tears streamed down her face as they handed her the cup filled with the water, the last remnant of her husband's life. She felt her world closing in on her, and yet she could do nothing but stand there, trembling, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Her heart screamed for justice, but all she could do was plead for mercy. Anne stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest as the women of the village glared at her with disdain. The air was thick with the tension of the ritual, the weight of the accusation bearing down on her like a mountain. She had been told time and again that drinking the water would clear her name, that it would cleanse her of the curse that had been placed upon her. But Anne's soul rebelled against the thought. The very idea of drinking the water that had washed the lifeless body of her beloved Peter, the man she had cherished above all else, was beyond comprehension. She had not killed him, she knew it, and no amount of torture would make her betray the truth. The women's voices became a relentless barrage of accusations and threats, their hands forcing the cup towards her trembling lips. Drink it! Prove your innocence! They shouted, their eyes burning with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. But Anne's resolve was unshakable. She pushed the cup away with a cry of horror. I will not drink it. I swear I did not kill him. I loved him. For a brief moment, there was silence. The world seemed to stop as Anne's words hung heavy in the air. But the silence quickly turned into a storm of rage. The women who had once smiled and greeted her with warmth now sneered and spat at her feet. The leader of the group, a woman with a heart as cold as ice, stepped forward, her eyes dark with fury. You refuse to drink the water, then you will pay the price, Anne. The curse they placed on her was as old as the village itself. Her refusal to partake in the ritual would mark her forever as an outcast. No one would dare speak to her. No one would look at her with kindness. Her life, already shattered by the loss of her husband, would now be filled with a far more insidious torment: isolation. You will be seen as a witch, the woman declared, her voice laced with venom. No woman shall be your friend. You will not attend the women's meetings. You will not go to the market. You are cursed, Anne, and no one would ever look at you the same way again. Anne felt her knees buckle beneath her. The weight of their words, of their hatred, crushed her spirit. She had refused to drink the water, believing in her heart that the truth would set her free. But now she was trapped in the nightmare of cruelty and suspicion. The village that had once been her home, the place where she had laughed and lived in peace with her family, had turned into a prison. The days that followed Peter's burial were filled with torment. Anne's every step was watched, her every move scrutinized. The villagers, once familiar faces, now looked at her with disgust, their eyes filled with suspicion. Her refusal to drink the water had sealed her fate. No one would speak to her. The women of the village crossed the street when they saw her coming, avoiding even the briefest glance. They would whisper behind her back, casting quick, hateful glances whenever she was near. The isolation was unbearable. Anne could feel the eyes of the community on her at all times. She couldn't go to the market to buy food for her children without being taunted and mocked. The shopkeepers, once friendly, now turned their backs on her, refusing to sell her goods. Even when she tried to offer money, it was as though her presence alone was enough to repel them. Her children, Tina and Victor, were not spared the cruelty of the village. At school, they were called the witch's children. The other children would point at them, whispering as they passed by. No one would play with them. Even the teachers who had once shown Anne kindness now avoided her children, their faces cold and indifferent. Anne tried to shield them from the hate that now surrounded her, but it was impossible. She watched helplessly as her once happy children grew quiet, their faces etched with confusion and fear. The playful laughter that had once filled their home had been replaced by a heavy silence. Tina, only 8 years old, would ask her why no one would talk to her or Victor, and Anne could only offer the heartbreaking truth. Because they think we are cursed, my love. Because they think your father's death was my fault. At night, when the darkness enveloped their small home, Anne would hold her children close, wishing she could protect them from the world's cruelty. But no matter how tightly she held them, the reality of their situation remained. She had lost everything: her husband, her friends, her place in the community, and now she was losing her children to the torment of their peers. Anne knew that she could not survive much longer in this state. The isolation, the accusations, and the abuse were taking their toll. Her once vibrant spirit was now a hollow shell, consumed by grief and despair. She had always believed that the truth would prevail, but now, in the face of such overwhelming cruelty, She began to wonder if she had made the right choice. Could there have been another way? Was there still hope for her family? As she lay in bed that night, tears streaming down her face, she could only pray for a miracle, something, anything that would break the curse and restore her family to the life they once had. Anne's heart was heavy as she packed the few belongings she had left after her in laws had claimed everything her husband had worked for. The house that once echoed with laughter and love now stood silent, a haunting reminder of all she had lost. Peter's clothes, his shoes, even the small trinkets he had cherished, gone. The injustice of it all burned within her like a raging fire, but she had no choice. She couldn't stay in that village any longer, not with the whispers and the cruelty, not with the constant reminder of how they had turned on her. The thought of leaving everything behind was painful, but Anne knew it was the only way to find peace. She had to protect her children. She had to protect herself. With tears in her eyes, she turned her back on the village that had once been home and set her sights on a new community, a fresh start, a place where she could rebuild her life from the ashes. The journey was long and arduous, but Anne never wavered. Her children, quiet and confused, walked by her side, and though they missed their father deeply, they found solace in their mother's strength. The new community was miles away, nestled between green hills and vast fields, a place where no one knew her story. Anne had no friends here, no family, no reputation to uphold. It was a clean slate, but it also felt like a place where she was completely invisible. When they arrived, the community welcomed them with cautious curiosity. Anne's presence stirred little more than polite greetings, and the children were given warm smiles, though there was an underlying hesitation from the villagers, unsure of how to truly accept the stranger in their midst. But Anne was determined. This was her chance. This was her chance to start over, to find a place where her children could grow without the shadow of the past looming over them. Anne found a small cramped space to rent. It wasn't much, just a tiny corner of a building with an open window and a few wooden planks for counters. But it was enough for her to begin again. She decided to start frying akara, the bean cakes she had always loved to make. They were simple, humble, and comforting, and she knew that if she could make a living from them, she would do so with everything she had. But the beginning was hard. Her first days in the new community were marked with silence. No one came to buy. She would set up early every morning, just as the sun was rising, and sit by her small frying pan, waiting. She tried to stay hopeful, but the lack of customers made her feel invisible again. The weather was sometimes unforgiving, with storms that turned the streets into rivers and the air thick with humidity. But Anne refused to let that stop her. She knew the road to success was paved with consistency, even if it meant starting small. By the time the sun began to set each day, Anne's hands were callous from stirring the beans, and her clothes would be soaked with sweat. But she never gave up. Every day, she woke at 5 a.m. to prepare the beans, carefully seasoning them with spices she had learned over the years. Each batch a reflection of her dedication. Despite the struggles, she worked tirelessly. She had made a vow to herself that no matter the cost, she would raise her children to the highest level of education they desired. They would not suffer the same fate as her. They would rise above the cruelty, the suffering, the poverty. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers of Anne's akara began to spread. At first, it was a few curious villagers who stopped by, lured by the smell wafting through the air. They hesitated, unsure of whether they wanted to try something from the woman who had just moved into the neighborhood. But once they tasted the crispy, flavorful bean cakes, they were hooked. Anne's consistency paid off. Each morning, as the sun began to rise, a small crowd would gather around her stall, eager to get a taste of her akara. Word of mouth had spread, and people started coming from neighboring communities just to try her cooking. Some came for breakfast, others for a midday snack, and before long, Anne had a steady stream of loyal customers. Her heart swelled with pride each time someone took a bite. Though her life was still far from easy, Anne felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer the widow, the outcast. She was Anne, the woman who made the best akara in the village. People began to recognize her, not as the woman accused of witchcraft, but as the hardworking, resilient woman who had managed to turn her life around. Anne smiled as she watched her children play nearby, their faces brighter than they had been in months. Tina and Victor were finally beginning to smile again, free from the cruel taunts of their former schoolmates. Anne knew they still carried the scars of their past, but she also knew that the future was theirs for the taking. As long as she had breath in her body, she would fight to give them the life they deserved. Each day, she worked harder than the last, determined to save enough money to send her children to school, to ensure they never had to endure the cruelty she had suffered. She refused to let the past define her, and she swore to herself that no matter what happened, her children would be free. Free to dream, free to hope, free to live. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Anne was no longer a woman defined by tragedy. She was a woman defined by strength. And the journey to her redemption had only just begun. As the years passed, Anne's small business began to flourish. What started as a humble akara store, set up in a cramped corner of the community, had now blossomed into a thriving enterprise. The aroma of her delicious bean cakes, coupled with the warm, comforting scent of early morning pap and fresh bread, had become the heart of the neighborhood. People from all walks of life, from farmers to school children, crowded her small space every morning, eager to sample the food that had now become synonymous with Anne's name. She had expanded her offerings, adding pap, smooth, silky, and sweet to taste, and bread that was soft and fluffy, just like the kind she used to make for her family before her world had crumbled. It wasn't just the food that kept the customers coming back. It was the dedication, the warmth, the passion Anne poured into every batch. But as her business grew, so did the demand. It was a challenge to keep up with the constant stream of customers, and there were days when Anne found herself exhausted, her hands sore from the hours of frying and cooking. It was clear she needed help. That's when she hired two young girls from the neighborhood, both eager and hardworking, to assist her. With their help, she was able to meet the growing demand and focus on expanding her business even further. Anne had come a long way from the broken woman who had left her old village in search of a fresh start. She had not only survived but thrived. Every morning she woke at 4 a.m., just as the stars faded from the sky, and by 5 a.m. she was already stirring the beans, setting the fire, preparing the pap, and getting ready to face the new day. Despite the exhaustion that came with the early mornings, Anne was determined to push forward. She was a woman who had lost everything once, and she would never let herself fall into despair again. Anne's children, Tina and Victor, had grown into fine young adults. Both were now in university, studying fields that demanded the utmost dedication. Tina, the eldest, had chosen computer science, her eyes set on becoming a software engineer. From a young age, Tina had been fascinated by technology, always tinkering with old computers and gadgets, trying to understand how they worked. Her interest in the subject had only deepened over the years, and now at the university, she was excelling in her studies. Anne couldn't have been prouder of her daughter, whose determination to succeed mirrored her own. Victor, the younger of the two, had followed a different path. He was studying medicine and surgery. Ever since he was a child, he had been drawn to the idea of helping people, of healing, and making a difference in the world. Anne remembered the days when he would play doctor with Tina, bandaging up dolls and pretending to perform surgeries. Now, As he pursued his dream of becoming a doctor, Anne couldn't help but marvel at how far he had come. The road was tough, but Victor was thriving, his academic record impeccable. He was the son of a woman who had fought for everything she had, and he had inherited that same fire. Both children knew the sacrifices their mother had made for them. They had seen the long hours she worked, the way she poured everything into her business, never asking for help or complaining. They knew that Anne's dream was to give them the best education possible, and they were determined not to let her down. Despite the hardships of their past, Tina and Victor had come to understand that their mother's strength had given them the opportunity to build a future for themselves. It was her hard work, her determination, and her love that had carried them through the darkest times. Now, as they studied in university, they were driven by the desire to honor her sacrifices and make her proud. But as Anne's life began to blossom, the shadows of her past still lingered, watching from the corners of her mind. The memories of the village, of the cruelty, of the accusations that had driven her away never truly left her. Anne had tried to bury those painful memories, to forget the day her life had been torn apart by the whispers of a community that had once been her family. There were nights when she would wake, her heart racing, the sound of angry voices echoing in her ears, the faces of the women who had shaved her head, who had forced her to choose between her dignity and her life, would appear in her dreams. The curse they had placed on her, branding her a witch, still haunted her. And though she had built a new life for herself, Anne knew that the past wasn't so easily erased. The pain and the shame of the accusations still gnawed at her, especially when she thought about her children's futures. She had given them everything, but what if the past came for them too? What if one day the old villagers showed up, bringing with them the ghosts of that dark time? There was always that fear, that lingering doubt in the back of her mind. What if the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered? And what if her children, her precious, hardworking children, became targets because of what had happened to her? But Anne pushed those thoughts away as she had done for years. Her children were doing well, thriving in their education, and her business was booming. She had created something beautiful out of the ashes of her past, and she would not let it be destroyed. As the years passed, Anne's heart grew stronger, her resolve unshakable. She would protect her children, shield them from the past that threatened to resurface, and continue to build a future where they could live without fear. She had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about rising again and again, no matter how hard the world tried to knock you down. Tina stood on the stage, her heart racing as the audience erupted into applause. She had come a long way from the young girl who had once helped her mother fry akara on the streets of a small, humble community. Now she was a recognized figure in the world of technology, a sought-after software developer and the founder of her own company. Her rise had been nothing short of extraordinary. Tina's journey had not been easy. She had faced the same struggles her mother had, late nights of studying, endless hours of hard work, and the constant pressure of proving herself. But unlike her mother, who had fought for survival in the shadows of suspicion, Tina had entered a world of prestige and recognition, a world where her talents were celebrated rather than condemned. Her company, Innovate Tech, had started small, just like her mother's Akara business, but it had quickly gained traction. The software she had developed for local businesses to streamline operations had caught the attention of global investors. The recognition didn't stop there. One of her most innovative creations, a platform designed to help underdeveloped communities access high-quality education, had garnered international praise. It was a breakthrough that promised to change the lives of millions, and Tina had become a global figure in the tech industry. Despite her success, Tina had never forgotten where she came from. She knew that none of it would have been possible without the sacrifices her mother had made. Anne had given up everything to ensure that Tina and Victor had the best opportunities in life. And now it was Tina's turn to repay that love and devotion. It had been years since Tina had left the small community where she had grown up. Now, as a successful tech mogul, she knew it was time to return. She had spoken to Victor, who was now well into his medical studies, and together they had made a decision, something that would change their mother's life forever. Tina arrived at her mother's home, her heart swelling with pride as she saw Anne standing in the doorway, her eyes bright with warmth and love. Anne had aged, but the strength and resilience that had carried her through the darkest times still radiated from her. Tina ran to her mother, embracing her tightly, the years of separation melting away in that moment. I've missed you, Mama, Tina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Anne smiled, her eyes tearing up. I've missed you too, my darling. You've come so far. I'm so proud of you. Tina looked at her mother, her eyes shining with determination. Mama, I promised you that I would wipe away your tears, and I'm going to do just that. You've worked too hard, sacrificed too much. It's time for you to live the life you deserve. Anne was taken aback, her heart beating faster as she tried to process her daughter's words. What do you mean, Tina? Tina smiled, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. Victor and I have made plans. We are going to build you a beautiful duplex, a home that's yours, one that you never have to worry about losing. You've always dreamed of having a place where you can rest, where you can live in peace. Well, that's what we are going to give you. Anne's breath caught in her throat as tears began to fall. She had always dreamed of owning a home, a place where she could feel safe and secure, but it had always seemed like an impossible dream, something out of reach. Now it was becoming a reality, and she could hardly believe it. You don't have to do this, Anne said, her voice shaking. You've already done so much for me. I don't need anything else. Tina took her mother's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. Yes, you do, Mama. You deserve this, and I'll make sure you get it. The promise Tina made to her mother was more than just words. It was a vow. A vow that no matter how high she climbed, no matter how successful she became, she would never forget the sacrifices that had shaped her. Her mother's strength had been the foundation of her success, and now Tina would build her mother a home that symbolized everything she had worked for. Victor had been equally moved by the idea of building a home for their mother. As he neared the completion of his medical studies, he knew that he too had a debt to repay. Anne had poured everything into their futures, and now it was their turn to return the favor. Together, Tina and Victor began to work on plans for the new home, envisioning every detail, from the spacious living room where Anne could finally relax, to the bright kitchen where she could cook without worry, to the garden where she could sit in peace. The family's efforts were not without challenges. The land was expensive and the building process was slow. But Tina's wealth, garnered through the success of Innovate Tech, and Victor's determination to make something of himself, ensured that the project moved forward. Every brick laid, every beam raised was a testament to Anne's sacrifices. And with every passing day, the vision of a new home for their mother became closer to reality. As the months went by, Tina's reputation continued to grow. She was invited to speak at conferences around the world, and Innovate Tech's products became essential tools for businesses and governments. Yet, despite her global success, Tina always made time for her family. She returned home often, making sure her mother knew how much she was loved and appreciated. She never allowed the pressure of her career to pull her away from the woman who had shaped her into the woman she had become. Victor, too, had begun to make a name for himself in the medical field. He had excelled in his studies, and now he was training to become a surgeon. Anne watched with pride as her children achieved their dreams, each step forward a reminder of the resilience and love that had carried them through their darkest days. But as the house began to take shape, so did Anne's sense of peace. Her children had given her a gift greater than any material possession. They had given her the future, a future where she could finally rest, knowing that her children would carry on the legacy of love, hard work, and sacrifice she had instilled in them. The day had arrived, the day Anne would finally see the fruits of her children's labor. Tina and Victor stood side by side, their faces beaming with pride as they watched their mother walk toward the grand duplex they had built for her. The home stood tall, gleaming in the afternoon sun, a symbol of their love, dedication, and the years of hardship that had finally paid off. The fresh coat of paint, the neatly manicured garden, and the spacious rooms, all of it was theirs, all for Anne. Anne's breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the house. It was more than just a building, it was a new beginning, a life free from the constant fear of losing everything. She had spent so many years fighting for her children, for their future, and now they had given her something far beyond what she could have ever imagined. She had always dreamed of a house, a place she could call her own, where she could find peace, a sanctuary from the world that had once rejected her. Tina, holding the keys to the house, stepped forward and handed them to Anne. Mama, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This is your home now. No more pain, no more suffering. You've earned this. Anne's hands shook as she accepted the keys, tears welling up in her eyes. She had never imagined this moment, never thought it would be possible. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't deserve this. You do, Mama, Victor said, stepping beside her. You deserve every bit of it. This is our gift to you for all the love and sacrifices you've made for us. As Anne stepped inside the house for the first time, her eyes scanned each room with awe. The walls that were once filled with emptiness now seemed to hum with life, with promise. But the surprises didn't end there. Tina handed her mother a key fob, and Anne looked at it in confusion. For you, Mama, Tina said, smiling. A new car. No more walking. No more struggling. You've earned it. Anne's hands trembled as she took the key. It was a symbol of freedom, a life where she no longer had to depend on others. She looked at her children, her heart swelling with love. You've given me everything, she said softly, her voice full of gratitude, everything I could ever want. The news of Anne's new home and her brand new car spread like wildfire across the neighboring communities. People who had once turned their backs on her, who had whispered behind her back, now found themselves talking about her children's success. They marveled at how Tina and Victor had defied the odds, achieving everything their mother had dreamed for them, and so much more. Anne was no longer the woman accused of witchcraft. She was the proud mother of two successful children who had built a future out of sheer willpower and love. It wasn't long before Anne's in-laws heard the news. The whispers reached them, and the shock was palpable. They had always expected Tina and Victor to remain poor, struggling like Anne had after Peter's death. They had assumed that the children would never rise above their circumstances, that they would live with the same burden of poverty that had haunted Anne for so many years. But now, seeing the success and prosperity their niece and nephew had achieved, the in-laws were left reeling. How had it happened? How had Anne's children managed to climb so high when they had been left with nothing? The very thought of Tina and Victor's success was enough to make them question everything they had ever known. The guilt weighed heavily on them as they realized how wrong they had been to accuse Anne of such horrible things. Meanwhile, Tina didn't stop there. With her newfound success, she turned her attention to something even more meaningful. She founded a charity organization dedicated to helping less privileged children gain access to education. She knew all too well what it was like to struggle, to feel as though opportunities were always just out of reach. So she made it her mission to ensure that other children didn't have to face those same obstacles. Her charity provided scholarships for underprivileged children, helping them attend school, offering them a chance to pursue higher education, just as she had. As Tina's charity gained momentum, it garnered attention from all over. The community saw her not just as a tech mogul, but as a force for good, someone who was using her success to make a real difference in the world. Her work in education became a beacon of hope for many, and soon it became the talk of the town. As news of Tina's charity reached Anne's old village, the villagers, particularly her in-laws, were stunned. They could hardly believe their ears. The children they had once condemned, the children they had expected to fail, had become successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The world had turned upside down, and the in-laws began to realize the magnitude of their mistakes. The idea that they had wronged Anne, that they had cast her aside and accused her of the most horrible things, now sat like a heavy stone on their hearts. They began to talk amongst themselves, wondering if it was time to seek forgiveness, to humble themselves before the woman they had so cruelly cast out. One by one, they began to think of ways they could make amends. They knew that Anne was now living a life they had never imagined possible. They had underestimated her children, and now the shame of their actions weighed heavily on them. Anne's in laws, once the source of so much pain in her life, began to discuss the possibility of visiting Anne, to apologize for their cruelty, and to beg for forgiveness. They knew that they had wronged her, and in the wake of her children's success, they realized that their actions had been fueled by jealousy and ignorance. They knew they could never erase the past, but they hoped that in time, Anne might find it in her heart to forgive them. The days following the news of Tina's charity had been filled with a flurry of activity. People from all over had begun to take notice of Anne's children, especially the transformation of their family's life. But none were more affected than Anne's in laws, the very people who had tormented her in the darkest days of her life. The weight of their actions had grown heavier with time as they witnessed the incredible rise of Tina and Victor, the children they had once dismissed as unworthy of success. They could no longer ignore the truth that their cruelty had been a mistake, that their accusations had been unfounded, and that they had broken a family that was now stronger than ever. Unable to bear the shame any longer, Anne's in-laws, along with the village head, decided to send a delegation to Anne and her children to ask for forgiveness. They knew this would be their only chance to make amends, to undo the harm they had caused, even if it could never fully erase the scars they had left behind. The delegation, a group of respectful elders, arrived at Anne's new home, each one carrying with them an air of humility that had not been present in the past. As Anne stood in her doorway, looking at the group of villagers who had once cast her aside, she felt a mixture of emotions rise within her: anger, sadness, and disbelief. But as their eyes met hers, she saw the sincerity in their faces, the regret that now clouded their once harsh expressions. They had come not as the people who had broken her, but as the people who were begging for healing. Tina, standing beside her mother, exchanged a glance with Victor. They had never imagined this day would come, the day when those who had wronged their family would come to them with open hands, seeking forgiveness. But here they were, standing at the threshold of their new life, and it was in this moment that Anne realized just how far they had come. The head of the delegation, an elderly woman who had once been a staunch supporter of Anne's in-laws, stepped forward, her voice filled with regret. "Anne," she began, her eyes downcast, "we have come to apologize for the wrong we did to you and your children, for the accusations, for the isolation, for the cruelty we subjected you to. We were wrong. We allowed jealousy and ignorance to cloud our judgment, and we have lived with the consequences of that ever since. We ask for your forgiveness, and we beg you to let go of the pain we caused." Anne stood still, her heart racing. She remembered every harsh word, every cruel gesture, every moment of suffering. The memories flooded back, and tears filled her eyes. She had spent years carrying that burden, but now, hearing these words, she wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved. The pain was still there, but so was the possibility of healing. Tina and Victor stood behind Anne, their expressions solemn. They knew how much this moment meant to their mother. After a long silence, Anne took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I never thought I would hear these words, she said softly. I've spent years trying to forget what you did to me, to my children. I cried so many nights feeling alone in a world that had turned its back on me. But I've learned that carrying that pain doesn't help anyone. My children, Tina and Victor, have shown me the power of forgiveness. They've taught me that healing is not just for me, but for everyone. She paused, looking at the delegation, her heart torn between the past and the present. I forgive you, she said, her voice stronger now, but not for you, for me, for my children, for the future we fought so hard to build. I can't change the past, but I can choose to move forward. The delegation looked at one another, their faces filled with relief. They had expected nothing less than rejection, but Anne had given them the gift of forgiveness. It was a gift that would change their lives forever. Tina stepped forward, her eyes locked with her mother's. Mama, I think forgiveness is important, but so is action. I want to offer some of our scholarship opportunities to the children of this village. If they are willing to learn, to work hard, I believe they deserve a chance at a better life. I know how much this community has struggled. Let's build a future together. The villagers were stunned. They had come to apologize, but in that moment, Tina was offering them more than forgiveness. She was offering them a chance at redemption, a chance to break the cycle of poverty and suffering that had plagued their lives for so long. The children of the village, many of whom had never been given a real opportunity to succeed, now had a chance at an education, a chance to rise above their circumstances. The elders, overwhelmed with gratitude, bowed their heads. We accept your offer with open hearts, one of them said. We will work to support this cause, to ensure that the children of this village can build a better future. The days following the delegation's visit were filled with a sense of peace Anne had not felt in years. The house, once a symbol of her suffering, was now a symbol of renewal, not just for her family but for the community as well. Tina's charity began to expand even further as she worked tirelessly to establish more scholarship programs for children in need, including those from her father's village. Victor, now a respected medical student, joined in the effort, offering medical support to the less fortunate in the surrounding areas. His expertise in healthcare became invaluable, and soon the entire region began to feel the impact of the family's efforts. What had once been a story of pain and hardship had now become a story of hope, healing, and transformation. Anne, Tina, and Victor lived their lives surrounded by the love of those they had helped, knowing that they had changed the course of their own destiny and the destiny of others. They have built a legacy that was not defined by the scars of the past, but by the strength to rise above it. As for Anne's in-laws, they kept their promise to continue supporting the children of the village, working hand in hand with Tina's charity to ensure a brighter future for all. The day came when Anne's in-laws visited her again, not as strangers seeking forgiveness, but as family eager to join in the rebuilding of the community. Anne, with a heart full of gratitude and peace, welcomed them with open arms. It was a moment of true healing, a moment where the past was finally laid to rest and a new chapter began. In the end, Anne's story was one of redemption, not just for herself, but for an entire community. Through love, sacrifice, and the power of forgiveness, she had turned the darkness of her past into a beacon of light for the future. And as she stood in her new home, surrounded by her children, her heart full of pride, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new journey, one where she would continue to help those in need, one person at a time. Thank you for watching. Please write your comment down in the comment section. What do you think about Anne's treatment by her in-laws? Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so that you will be notified whenever we post new video. Bye!